I was raised a devout Catholic, but in my teenage years I discovered alcohol. Somehow I knew in my heart that if I ever began using alcohol or drugs, I would never stop. As an adult, I lived my life on my own terms and ended up becoming addicted to drugs. After 17 years of using, I still didn't believe that I had a serious problem with drugs. I thought that I could quit any time I wanted to. Once I tried to convince a coworker to go to the bar with me after work. I had no idea that he was a recovering alcoholic with 1 year sober. He began sharing a bit of his story with me and eventually showed me the 20 questions of Alcoholics Anonymous. Those questions help a person to identify whether or not they might have a problem with alcohol. I just substituted the word drugs for alcohol and ended up answering 19 out of the 20 questions yes. I was so shocked and devastated that I began to cry. My friend offered to take me to my very first Narcotics Anonymous meeting that night, but I instantly backed away. Surprisingly, however, the very next evening I went to a meeting on my own. I was admitted into a treatment program, and as a part of that program, we were given a paper to read about feelings that addicts often have. I couldn't believe how many feelings I identified with. That was the moment when I realized that I was, in fact, an addict. In total despair, I could only think of suicide, but God prompted me to go to a meeting that night. I knew that if I didn't clean up, I would surely die, and suddenly I wanted to live. Once I admitted to myself that I really was addicted to drugs, that I couldn't just stop whenever I felt like it, I settled into the 12-step program and began working the steps with a sponsor. But by this time I had a solid hatred for God, and I made that clear to everyone at the meetings. I could accept the reference to a higher power, and like so many others, I called that higher power God. But I had such a distorted concept of God that I just made him up to be whatever kind of God I wanted him to be. I began to investigate the claims of Christianity once again, and this time I fell in love with Jesus Christ. But I still had trouble with the concept of God the Father. That name invoked images I still thought deserved none of my respect. By this time, I had gotten involved in a Bible study entitled Experiencing God. During that study, we were to read a list of names for God. I saw so many of the names that I loved, names such as my rock, forgiving God, and Father of compassion. And I figured that they were referring to Jesus, since I used the names Jesus and God interchangeably. But later, when I read names specifically for Jesus, ideas such as the image of the invisible God and the exact representation of his being surfaced, and I suddenly realized the truth about my Father God. I then understood that if I had seen the Son, I had indeed seen the Father. Knowing the truth about God the Father changed everything. I was able to submit to him and let him begin to change me. All the lies that I had believed were completely defeated. However, it took a great deal of brokenness, of going my own way, before I was humbled enough to allow God to woo me to himself. When I knew I was moving to Edmonton, I asked my pastor where I should go to church. I knew that I needed to be immersed in a church immediately upon arriving. He knew Pastor Keith and suggested Beulah. As it turned out, I ended up living in the West End and have been attending Beulah ever since the summer of 2000. I had the immense privilege of spending 7.5 years working on staff here until last spring. I had been attending seminary part-time while working here, and now I'm attending full-time in order to graduate this spring. My transformation has taken several years, but it has been a 180-degree shift. I came from a life of hatred toward God, of living in the filth of the world, to being a seminary student whose greatest desire is to help others understand who God really is. As God continues to reveal more of himself to me, my passion to teach biblical literacy continues to grow. I couldn't imagine doing anything other than dedicating my life to his service, regardless of whatever type of job I end up working at. I was saved for a purpose, not simply to indulge myself in feelings of forgiveness and cleansing. God has something he wants me to do in this life, and he expects me to be about that work. I take that very seriously. It's true that when you do what God requires, you're happy. I couldn't imagine living outside the presence of God. I know without a doubt that whatever hardships I have to go through, God has paved the way especially and lovingly, just for me.